Somewhere in medieval England, a person lies awake in the dark. It's the middle of the night. They've already been asleep once tonight. And now they're wide awake again, mind racing, staring at a ceiling they can't see. If this happened to you tonight, you'd assume something was wrong. You'd call it insomnia. You'd start Googling symptoms. They didn't panic at all. They got up, quietly stoked the fire, and started their day's first real thinking. Read that again. They weren't panicking. They were following a schedule. For most of human history, going back to ancient Greece and Rome, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a disorder. It was just Tuesday. But that doesn't mean ancient people never struggled with real, genuine sleeplessness, the kind that wasn't part of any normal rhythm at all. And when it did happen, they didn't just lie there. They built entire systems, chemical, medical, and psychological, to fight back against it. By the end of this, you'll understand that insomnia isn't a modern invention, and neither is the fight against it. We tend to treat insomnia like a distinctly modern condition, something caused by blue light, doom scrolling, work stress, and a world that never fully switches off, with nothing but darkness and silence to lull them under. That picture is mostly wrong. It's tempting to imagine our ancestors sleeping deeply and effortlessly, exhausted from physical labor, and the historical record makes that fairly clear. Historian Roger E. Kirsch spent decades combing through diaries, court records, medical texts, and literature, and found more than 2,000 references across a dozen languages to people being awake in the deep middle of the night. Going back as far as ancient Greece, some of those references describe a completely normal, expected rhythm. Others describe something closer to genuine distress, worry, restlessness, an inability to settle. It's worth sitting with how specific some of this documentation actually gets, described in language that sounds remarkably close to how we describe insomnia today. These aren't vague, secondhand references either. Private diaries describe the specific frustration of a mind. That won't quiet down. Medical texts list symptoms, causes, and proposed remedies in exhaustive detail, the way you might mention a headache. This wasn't a rare. Court testimony references sleeplessness almost casually, as an ordinary understood part of daily human experience. Unusual complaint buried in obscure texts. It was common enough, across enough centuries and enough cultures, to leave a genuinely substantial paper trail behind. So here's the real question worth asking. If sleeplessness has been documented for roughly 2,500 years, in cultures with no electricity, no screens, and none of the modern stressors we blame it on, what does that actually tell us? Either something about being human itself occasionally disrupts sleep, regardless of technology or the story we tell ourselves about simple, well-rested ancestors was never quite accurate to begin with. Let's look at what the actual historical evidence shows, because it splits into two genuinely different categories that are easy to accidentally blur together. The first category is what historians now call segmented or biphasic sleep. And it wasn't a disorder at all. It was simply how most people slept. For most of history, before artificial lighting pushed bedtimes later and compressed the night into sleep for 3 or 4 hours in what was called first sleep, wake up naturally, a single block. People would go to bed a couple of hours after dark, calmly, without any distress, stay awake for an hour or two, is what makes it so convincing. References to a divided night show up not just, and then drift into second sleep until morning. The consistency of this pattern across cultures, in Western European sources, but across the Mediterranean, in various African societies, and in parts of the Middle East, each describing some version of the same basic structure with remarkably little variation. And the language used to describe the transition between the two sleeps was often so casual, so completely unremarkable, that historians initially almost missed it. Entirely buried in plain sight inside routine, everyday sentences that assumed every reader would immediately understand exactly what was being described. References to this pattern show up constantly once you know to look for them. Homer's Odyssey mentions it. Roman writers referenced it as an ordinary part of the day, the way we'd mention breakfast. Medieval court records occasionally note that a crime happened after first sleep, treating it as a completely unremarkable timestamp, the same way you might say something happened after lunch. And the waking window itself wasn't wasted or distressing. People used it for prayer, since many religious traditions considered the quiet hours around midnight spiritually significant. They tended dying fires, nursed infants, had conversations with bedmates, occasionally visited neighbors, and in some documented cases, this stretch of calm, unhurried wakefulness was even considered an ideal time for intimacy, since the body was rested and there was, quite literally, nowhere else to be. This pattern apparently began to collapse once artificial light let people push bedtime later, and later compressing two natural phases into one longer block. Once that happened, waking up in the middle of the night stopped looking like a normal rhythm and started looking, to anyone unfamiliar with the older pattern, like something had gone wrong. Here's a common assumption worth challenging directly, that if you wake up at 3 a.m. and lie there for a while before falling back asleep, something is medically wrong with you. Read that again, though, because the historical pattern suggests something considerably less alarming. If you wake up in the deep middle of the night, feel calm, alert, maybe even clear-headed, and then drift back to sleep an hour or so later without much effort, you're not malfunctioning. You're very possibly experiencing a faint echo of the exact biphasic rhythm humans followed for most of recorded history, a pattern your biology may never have fully abandoned, even though your bedtime habits have. There's a genuinely useful, practical takeaway buried in this distinction, too. Sleep researchers today increasingly suggest that some modern cases of middle-of-the-night waking, particularly ones that don't come with real distress attached, might actually improve simply by removing the anxiety around the waking itself. If lying awake for a while stops feeling like a red flag symptom and starts feeling like an old, familiar rhythm reasserting itself, the anxiety that often makes it genuinely hard to fall back asleep may lose a significant part of its grip entirely. In other words, the history itself might function as a mild, unexpected treatment. That said, this isn't a case of everything ancient people experienced at night was actually fine and healthy. The second category of evidence Kirch and other historians uncovered describes something distinctly different: genuine, distressing sleeplessness, an inability to fall asleep at all, or to stay asleep in any restful way, described with real anguish across historical medical texts. Medieval physicians wrote specifically about people whose minds wouldn't quiet down once they lay in the dark, worry and anguish keeping them awake long past any natural waking window, night after night in ways that clearly weren't part of a normal, expected rhythm. So the honest, more nuanced picture looks like this. Some of what feels like modern insomnia is actually an old, healthy, biological pattern that industrialization taught us to fear. But real disruptive sleeplessness, driven by anxiety, illness, grief, or unresolved stress, has also existed for as long as anyone bothered to write about the night at all. Ancient people weren't uniformly peaceful sleepers waiting to be ruined by modern life. Some of them lay awake for the exact same reasons we do. And they needed real solutions, not just an accepted rhythm to fall back on. Let's go even further. Because when ancient sleeplessness genuinely was a problem, different cultures built surprisingly sophisticated systems to fight back against it. Long before anyone understood the biology involved, ancient Egyptians used opium poppy extract specifically for its sedative properties, understanding purely through observation that it reliably brought on sleep, even without any concept of the specific compounds responsible. Greek and Roman healers took a similar approach, mixing wine with various plant alkaloids to help people sleep, treating sleeplessness as a genuine medical complaint worth actively treating rather than something to simply endure. Hippocrates himself developed an entire theoretical framework around it, tying disrupted sleep to an imbalance in the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. The theory itself was wrong in almost every specific detail, but the underlying instinct that sleeplessness had an identifiable physical cause and could potentially be corrected was a genuinely important step toward treating insomnia as medicine rather than mystery. That instinct got dramatically more sophisticated centuries later. The Persian physician Avicenna, writing in his massive medical text, The Canon of Medicine, around the year 1025, dedicated real, detailed attention to insomnia specifically, describing multiple distinct causes, including mental preoccupation and emotional distress, centuries before Western medicine seriously entertained the idea that Anxiety itself could be a direct cause of sleeplessness rather than a vague secondary symptom. It's worth pausing on just how methodical some of these ancient approaches actually were. Avicenna's canon of medicine didn't simply mention insomnia in passing. It organized potential causes into distinct categories: physical illness, digestive disturbance, emotional turmoil, and environmental discomfort among them, and matched each category to a different recommended treatment. That's not folklore. That's an early, genuinely systematic attempt at differential diagnosis, applied specifically to a problem modern medicine often still treats as a single generic complaint rather than a cluster of genuinely different underlying causes. Medieval Europe, meanwhile, leaned on considerably more dangerous tools. Mandrake and belladonna, both genuinely capable of inducing sleep, were widely used specifically because they worked despite carrying serious risks of toxicity and hallucination that medieval healers understood only partially, largely through trial, error, and unfortunate personal experience. Ancient Mesopotamian medicine approached the problem from yet another angle, blending practical herbal treatment with ritual and prayer, on the belief that persistent sleeplessness might stem from spiritual disturbance as much as physical imbalance. Specific incantations survive in the historical record, recited specifically to ease a troubled mind before sleep, alongside more straightforward herbal preparations. Whether or not the spiritual framework held any literal truth, the ritual itself likely provided something genuinely useful: a structured, repeatable, calming routine performed at the exact same point every single night, functioning remarkably similarly to what modern sleep specialists now call a wind-down routine. On the other side of the world, traditional Chinese medicine developed its own detailed herbal approach entirely independently, relying heavily on herbs like xuanzao, ren, and valerian root, both of which modern research has since confirmed genuinely interact with the same calming neurological pathways targeted by many modern sleep medications. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth mentioning because it shows just how seriously ancient cultures took the psychological side of sleeplessness. 2. Physicians going back to the Roman era recognized a specific condition, called ephialtes in Greek and incubus in Latin, essentially an early medical category for the intense psychological and physical trauma that could accompany a terrifying night, treating nightmares and severe anxiety-driven wakefulness as a real, legitimate medical issue worth diagnosing. Centuries before modern psychology had any framework for anxiety disorders at all. It's also worth noting how differently ancient cultures thought about the relationship between mind and body when it came to sleep, compared to the strict separation modern medicine spent much of the 20th century insisting on. Avicenna and various Mesopotamian healers alike treated emotional turmoil and physical illness as genuinely intertwined causes of the same basic symptom, rather than two entirely separate categories requiring entirely separate specialists. Modern sleep medicine has, in many respects, spent the last few decades quietly circling back toward that same integrated view, treating anxiety, mood, and physical sleep disruption as parts of a single connected system, rather than isolated, unrelated problems. There's also something worth noting about how these remedies actually traveled. Trade routes carried more than silk and spices. Knowledge about which plants reliably induced sleep moved along the same paths, absorbed, adapted, and reinterpreted by each culture that encountered it. A remedy first documented in one region could resurface, slightly altered, thousands of miles away and centuries later, carried by merchants, physicians, only a practical interest in whatever demonstrably worked. That kind of quiet, and travelers who had no formal system for citing their sources. But it likely did more to actually help ordinary, struggling sleepers, generation after generation, than almost any single ruler or recorded historical event. Here's where it gets a little uncomfortable in a genuinely interesting way. Strip away the branding and the packaging, and modern sleep culture is running a strikingly familiar playbook. Melatonin supplements, now sitting in millions of medicine cabinets, function on essentially the same principle ancient healers were working toward blindly. Find a substance that nudges the body towards sleep, and use it deliberately when natural sleep won't come on its own. Valerian root, one of the exact herbs traditional Chinese medicine relied on centuries ago, is still sold today, largely unchanged, in the supplement aisle of any modern pharmacy. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, now considered the gold standard modern treatment, leans heavily on exactly the kind of structured mental reframing Avicenna was already gesturing toward 1,000 years ago, treating the thoughts and anxiety surrounding sleeplessness as just as important to address as the sleeplessness itself. The specific tools have obviously changed dramatically. The underlying insight that a racing, anxious mind is often the actual obstacle rather than the body's basic capacity for sleep turns out to be considerably older than any modern therapy office. Even the specific advice keeps recycling. Modern sleep hygiene guidelines recommend winding down the natural darkness and calm that used to arrive automatically once the sun went down. Before bed, dimming lights, avoiding stimulation, essentially asking people to recreate as closely as possible. We didn't invent the concept of preparing the mind and body for sleep. We just have to deliberately manufacture the conditions our ancestors got for free. Once artificial light and constant stimulation made naturally winding down considerably harder to do. So let's bring this together. We tend to imagine two extremes when it comes to ancient sleep. Either our ancestors slept perfectly and modern life ruined it, or nothing about their experience resembles our own struggles at all. Neither picture is quite accurate. Some of what feels like modern insomnia is actually an old, healthy biphasic rhythm that industrial life taught an entire civilization to fear. But real sleeplessness, driven by worry, grief, or unresolved stress, has existed for as long as anyone bothered to write about the night. Treated seriously enough that entire medical traditions grew up specifically to address it. Consider just how long this problem has genuinely persisted, essentially unresolved in any complete sense. Roughly 1 in 3 people today report struggling with some form of insomnia at some point in their lives. Read that again. 1 in 3, despite thousands of years of accumulated treatment, from opium to Avicenna's careful diagnostic categories to modern prescription medication. Sleeplessness never actually went away. It just kept accumulating better tools to fight back with, generation after generation, without ever fully winning the underlying battle. That persistence says something important on its own. The right app or the right supplement if we simply tried hard enough. Insomnia isn't a design flaw unique to modern civilization, something we could theoretically fix with. It appears to be a genuinely old, recurring feature of being a creature with a mind complex enough to worry, running headfirst into a biological need simple enough to demand total stillness. Every culture that ever grappled with that mismatch ended up building its own version of the exact same toolkit. Something to calm the body, something to quiet the mind, and a structured routine to signal that the day was actually, finally, over. From opium poppy in ancient Egypt to Avicenna methodically cataloging the psychological causes of sleeplessness 1,000 years ago to valerian roots still sitting quietly in modern pharmacies, the fight against genuine insomnia has never really stopped. It just keeps changing packaging. It's worth sitting with how much genuine trial and error sits behind even the herbal remedies that eventually got things dangerously wrong. Mandrake and belladonna weren't reckless guesses. They were chosen because they demonstrably worked, at least some of the time. And it took centuries of accumulated harm, alongside accumulated success, before anyone could reliably separate an effective dose from a dangerous one. Modern pharmacology inherited both the successes and the hard-won caution that came from that long, difficult process. That person from the beginning, awake in the medieval dark, calmly tending a fire between two natural phases of sleep, wasn't broken and wasn't suffering. They were simply living inside a rhythm we've since forgotten how to trust. None of these ancient systems required modern neuroscience to be genuinely useful, either. They required only patient, repeated observation. Notice what calms a restless mind. Notice what reliably brings on sleep. Discard what doesn't work and pass the surviving knowledge down carefully enough that it outlasted the person who first discovered it. And it's worth remembering that most of the people who contributed to that accumulated knowledge never saw the full picture themselves. A healer in ancient Mesopotamia had no idea their incantation would echo, thousands of years later, in the structure of a modern bedtime routine. Avicenna had no way of knowing his careful categories of causes would anticipate a therapeutic. approach still considered cutting edge a millennium afterward. Each of them simply solved the small, local version of the problem directly in front of them, and left behind just enough of an answer for the next person to build on. It's a quietly humbling thought that the small ritual you might follow tonight, dimming a light, brewing a specific tea, settling your mind before finally closing your eyes, connects you to an unbroken chain of people doing essentially the same thing for essentially the same reason, stretching back considerably further than most of us ever stop to consider. So the next time you wake up at 3 a.m. feeling strangely calm and clear-headed, don't panic and don't assume something is automatically wrong. You might just be remembering a rhythm your body never actually forgot. And if sleep genuinely won't come, if the wakefulness feels less like calm clarity and more like real distress, know that you're not experiencing some uniquely modern failure either. You're facing the same old, for well over 2,000 years, difficult problem humans have been actively fighting with steadily improving tools,